Brave brand messaging happens in close collaboration between the brand and its agencies. In this episode, I'm joined by the marketing director of Nando's South Africa, Jessica Wheeler. There aren't that many brands that are as humorous, brave, and spicy in their communication as Nando's is. But how do they do it?
You know, everybody speaks about Nando's being a brand that is brave, right? And what's really important is that brave is not just something that we say about our ads or, it's not just a thing that we say as the marketing team. It's part of our values as a business.
Jessica Wheeler answers this and many other questions about their creative approach, AI, and how they make their mark in global markets. My name is Mongezi Mtati, and this is The Lead Creative. Welcome to the Lead Creative Podcast, where we talk to creative industry leaders, influencers, and brands. We discuss the strategies that influence brand thinking and shape industries. Thought leaders and heads of agencies let us in on some of their thinking and insights. I'm your host, Mongezi Mtati. Enjoy the show, and please share and subscribe. Jessica, thanks so much for making the time to join us on The Lead Creative. What an honor to have you on the show. I've been looking forward to this. And of course, like everybody else, I've been following Nando's and chuckling over the work that you put out there. So I look forward to really digging into what makes that.
I'm equally excited. I mean, it goes without saying that for 20 years, I too have been following Nando's and it's always been my dream job. And now I have it. Now I have the responsibility of not messing it up.
I'm sure you won't. What do you think drew you to marketing growing up as a kid? What is it about this sort of marketing and advertising space that kind of stood out for you?
So it's a strange story. I never intended to land up in marketing. It happened by complete accident. I was actually studying economics and then I landed up at a PR agency and kind of worked my way from PR to social media to digital to strategy, entirely at the agency side. So I've worked at agencies for nearly 20 years before I landed up at Nando's. So marketing, it was literally just by accident. I didn't leave school and think, I'm going to go work in marketing, because to be honest, I didn't even know what it was at the time. I thought you had to go, study accounting or economics or something that sounded really impressive, but landed up by accident in marketing and have never looked back a day in my life.
Yeah, and you've done amazing work since. And I'd really like to delve into, I think, your marketing, your sort of agency experience now that you're on the brand side. But before we get into that, we've had a number of episodes where Nando's came up as a brand that is brave in their advertising and marketing. In fact, we've spoken to an agency leader, or at least a creative industry leader, who worked with Nando's at some point. How do you maintain that consistency as a brand? You mentioned that you've followed Nando's for 20 years. How do you maintain that consistency? And how do you know that something will resonate in your spicy communication?
So I'll answer that in two parts. The first part is, everybody speaks about Nando's being a brand that is brave, right? And what's really important is that brave is not just something that we say about our ads or it's not just a thing that we say as the marketing team. It's part of our values as a business. So, the reason we're able to keep it up and the reason it's, been going for as long as it has is because it's fundamentally a part of how we do business, not just how we do marketing or how we make TV ads. So, when it comes to things like culture driving behavior, absolutely being brave and being curious is central to how we do business. So it becomes an inevitable part of how we build our brand and how we communicate. So saying, go out there and be brave or go be creative, if you don't fundamentally believe that as a business and if you don't have the whole business behind you and in support of that, it's going to fall flat, or it's going to be really, really hard to maintain over time. So bravery absolutely has to be at the core of what you do as a business, not just what you do as a brand. The second part of that, in terms of how do we know things are going to resonate? We don't, right? And part of being brave and part of being curious is being open to the fact that things are going to fail, and some things just aren't going to work as you anticipate them to work. So we have a good idea. We have I don't want to make it sound unsexy. We have a formula, and we have a way that we review things, and we discuss things to make sure it has a better chance. But, of the 3 things that you may recall about Nando's as being really exceptional, really brave, there's probably another 10 or 20 that you didn't even see, because they didn't pick up that momentum. And you've got to be okay with that, because if you're going to measure success on everything and, have this desire or this pressure to perform on every piece of comms or everything that you put into the world, it's just never going to happen, and you're going to get demotivated. So yeah, you've got to be prepared to fail, and you've got to work in an organization that is okay with some things just not working out as much as you planned them to.
Yeah. What is the biggest realization for you when you made that switch from agency to brand, especially when you were now, as you're now behind the scenes at Nando's? Like, what was the perception that you had before working at an agency, looking at Nando's as an outsider, and now that you're an insider, that was one of the biggest eye openers for you?
So the great thing is, and I mean, God, it sounds like I've drunk the Kool-Aid, and I absolutely have, but as you see Nando's from the outside is as Nando's is on the inside. It feels more like an agency than some of the agencies I've worked at, because of that culture of creativity and being brave and making mistakes. So it's got almost the same kind of bones and DNA of agencies. The biggest shock to me, and it sounds pathetic, is that realization that, guys, advertising is maybe 1/20th of the things that marketing is. It's the part that people see, it's the part that people love, it's the part that ad people in particular, get all hyped up about. But it really is one of the smallest parts of my day, is working on the ad side of things. The other is, all the work that's got to go into behind the scenes to get to a point where we have a proposition or something that we want to take to market. So the ad part is the fun part, but it's also one of the smallest parts of what we actually do in the marketing team at Nando's on a day-to-day basis.
What I'm getting is this sense that your messaging and the messaging and the brand and the advertising that we experience as consumers, and sometimes we try to analyze as marketers as well, is something that has to be core to the brand. It has to be the foundation. So basically, as a brand, you can't come up, as some brands have, you can't come up and say, make us the Nando's of banking, or make us the Nando's of fashion, or make us the Nando's of this. You can't start at that superficial level. It has to be from the ground up, from the foundation of the brand.
Absolutely. I mean, I'd go so far as to say that any brand has the potential to be the Nando's of their category, if that's what they aspire to be. But you don't just go out on a Monday and decide that's what you're going to be, or you don't just have that point of view for this one campaign or this, one marketing initiative. It's got to be baked into what you do, because then it becomes sustainable. It becomes repeatable. Very often you'll have, in many organizations, the marketing team is seen as a cost center, and they're seen, you guys are there to drive demand and create leads or whatever. I'm just thinking from a car brand point of view. You go create the leads, and the rest of the business isn't really on board. So you kind of have this internal tension. So if you don't have the whole business on board, if it's not part of your culture, if it's not the way of doing things, absolutely you can change it, but that's going to take time.
That makes sense, and I think that's a very important part of, I suppose, those conversations, because as I've said, I have seen one or two brands or at least sat across from one or two brands that have said, we want our communication to be the Nando's of X or Y, and that really doesn't work if it's just a campaign or doing it just for a particular campaign and it's not really core to your business. One of the seasoned creative industry leaders, as I said earlier, that we spoke to worked on Nando's, and this was before social media when they worked on Nando's, which is a really interesting time for insight as well, because things weren't as quick as they are today. But one of the things that he mentioned was that speed was really important in responding to current events, current issues, that something was mentioned in the news today or something was mentioned in the newspaper today. They have to send that to client and then get a response and then go into design. How important is that speed in responsiveness, which is also contributed to a lot by how well or how quickly the client responds to the agency, and you've been on both sides. So how important is that in responding to issues and being current?
I mean, in this day and age, it's absolutely important, right? I mean, I think the news cycle is so ferocious, and it is just changing by the minute now, not even by the hour anymore. So you've got to absolutely be fast, but you've also got to have the discipline. We sit on these amazing opportunities where we've spent a couple of hours between us and the agency crafting it, and then we have to have the discipline to be like, whoa, guys, the time, it's no longer relevant. People don't care about this anymore. We have to kind of kill our own children sometimes. So you've got to be able to have that discipline. But speed is absolutely important. I think it's probably, it's more important to get to market with something that is 80% there than to wait till it's 100% and it's 3 hours late. Nobody's going to care. So it was important back then. It is hyper important now, but the discipline to be able to let it go as well, particularly at the moment with how quickly things are changing, is really important.
How often does that happen? How often do you have to go, or rather, what percentage of your work would you say goes into the no longer relevant pile because things are changing so quickly?
I would say on a weekly basis, there's probably 60% of the things that we work on these quick turnaround tacticals. But by the time we have, an approval or we have a really good direction that everyone's behind, we go back and we look, as an example, at the Twitter feed or the X feed, look at the volume of conversation, look if the sentiment has changed. And that happens 60% of the time. Again, especially right now when there's so much that people are talking about leading up to the elections, it goes like this. And then 60% of the time we've got to say, guys, amazing stuff. Let's put it in the drawer. Maybe it'll resurface next week. Something else will happen related to the story, and we'll whip it out again. But you only 40% of our efforts get to see the light of day in a good week.
That's interesting. That's interesting. And how do you think that would have fared if you were on the agency side and you were telling your client that actually 40% of the work that we do will be successful? Like, do clients respond well rather to that? I mean, I know you are the client in this side, but like when you were at agency,
I think it also bears testament to the length of our agency relationships. We've got really long agency partnerships. So I would imagine as well, and having been on the other side not so long ago, it can be quite soul destroying that you can have this kind of ramp up of activity and get stuff out in this, barrage of options, and you're crafting it, and then you get to a point where everyone's happy, and then you have to kill it. I can imagine that, from an agency point of view, it can get a little bit disheartening, but because we've got these long-term relationships and partnerships with our agencies, they know this and they accept it. And I assure you they are equally remunerated for it. So it's not like we're like, okay, well, that didn't go to market, we're not paying for it. It doesn't work that way, because often often in that process, we may find another 2 or 3 tangents that we're like, oh, that's going to be interesting. Let's just put that one on the side because we may need that, next month, or we may use that for a retail campaign. So nothing goes to waste. And often, when you're under these time pressures and you have, a group of people, both from different agencies and the client side, all working together in a very concentrated period of time, you get the most amazing ideas, you get the most amazing insights. So there is nothing wasted and there is nothing lost. I can imagine if it was a new agency relationship, they'd get a little bit frustrated because it's a lot of, push to the finish line and don't cross it. But we've got really great partnerships. We've got really great relationships with them. So they're used to this being the way of working.
If you're enjoying The Lead Creative, please share this episode with your network and hit follow or subscribe. Enjoy the show. How do you establish that? How do you get to a point where you've built those client agency relationships? Because, as you've said, because in many instances you have these long-standing relationships with your agencies, that you understand each other, you've built that. What does it take to get to that point where you've built that kind of relationship with your agency where it's a real partnership? Because that's one of the issues with very many agency leaders sometimes that you've spoken to, where we work together, but sometimes it doesn't really feel like a partnership. It doesn't really feel like the agency is an extension, is a good extension of the brand. How do you get that? How do you get it right?
So it takes work, right? So I suppose it's like, it sounds so dreadful, but it really is like a marriage. It takes work, and you can't just assume that, okay, great, we've got an agency on board, and all agencies want to work on Nando's because they see the kind of work that goes out. So let's just assume that they know how we get to a point where we can work together. And it doesn't work that way. You've got to have, the first thing you absolutely have to have, and as the foundation of anything, is good chemistry. Like I said, we've got great long-term relationships with our agencies. We know staff turnover is a thing at agencies, so we're having new people join that team all the time and making sure that there is a great chemistry with those people, and whether they work in client service or strategy, or they're outputting from a design point of view, that they have a fundamental desire to make great, brave work is really important. If they don't, then it just seems to stick, right? If they just want to, get through a status report and tick it off, it's just never going to be conducive to producing the kind of work that we want to produce. So chemistry is absolutely important. Making sure that they are completely up to speed with what's happening on the business side of things, so that they can understand our process of prioritization. Because again, when you're working in an agency, you're only looking at the comms output of things. You're forgetting that there's a 80 to 90% of other things that your client is working on at any given point in time. So when you're not getting feedback quickly, or, you need feedback on, a project that's going to launch in 2 to 3 months, and you're getting frustrated because you're not getting that feedback, if you don't understand what that client's busy dealing with or what the context is, it's going to be frustrating. So we want to keep our agencies up to speed with what's happening in the business. What are the key projects that they don't touch and that they don't see, but that they can influence if they have a point of view? So chemistry, communication, generally comms people, we are the worst at communications because we take so much for granted, but you've got to over communicate. And then generally you just want to work with nice people, right? Everyone wants to have good, friendly working relationships. When you're on a shoot with somebody for 16 hours, it's so much better if you can get along with that person, and if you have a great relationship and you can have a laugh, and you can do silly things on shoot to pass the time. That's the kind of working relationship that produces good work, because there's no egos. We're all trying to do the same thing here.
Yeah. The humor that we find in Nando's work resonates a lot with a lot of people, with very many of us. But in very many ways, humor is also a personal thing. You mentioned that there are instances when you can get it wrong. What happens when you get it wrong? And how important is having a good relationship with your community for instances when you do?
Yeah. So I think, the benefit of social media, and I can't believe I'm going to say this might be a career limiting move, but I'm going to say it anyway. The benefit of social media, particularly on work that doesn't quite land with the impact or the shareability that we'd wanted to do, is that it's quite easily forgotten, right? So if we put out something that's a little bit vanilla, the internet will forget it very quickly, right? So we don't have to pay school fees on that mistake for very long. Because we have again, I'll use the word formula, and it's really not scientific at all. It's just some principles that we have in the work that we put out. The likelihood of us getting stuff wrong to the point that we may get, cancelled, or that we may seriously offend people, it's very unlikely, because it just doesn't follow the principles of how we create this work. So we're more at risk of putting out work that is forgettable than work that is controversial to the point where it becomes a very big, social media uproar. We do have, I would imagine, built over decades now, license to push the envelope a little bit more than most brands would. And that's kind of the dividends of many years of sticking by our guns and sticking by the kind of work that we put out. So we probably get away with a lot more than, if another brand just tried to be, cool and say something edgy, that there's a chance they're going to get annihilated on social media. We don't have that. Finding something that is universally humorous is flippin' difficult. And it's a lot of conversation, and it's a lot of arguing, and not in a bad way, like productive arguing between ourselves internally, us and the agency and the production company, the director. We've all got to believe that it is acceptably humorous for South Africans. So yeah, the risks are there; they will always be there. But we're quite confident that we have a way of conceptualizing work and putting work out there that at biggest risk is going to be forgettable if we don't do it good enough.
How does the messaging translate between South Africa and the UK? Because once again, there's the universally humorous, and there are also things that are locally humorous in a way. How do you get that right between the two markets?
Well, I can assure you that everything we find funny in South Africa, nobody in any of our other markets finds funny. We have a very distinct humor in this country. We have an ability to laugh at ourselves, which is almost unique in the markets in which we operate. How we show up in particularly in the UK market, there are brand assets that are absolutely central and core and true, but our tone of voice and our personality and our humor in the UK is completely different to how it is here. Those are not the things that govern our global brand. The things that govern our global brand are having a consistent visual identity, a consistent experience, in one of our restaurants, or our casas as we call it. You've got to have flex in your brand to be able to adopt the culture, the humor, the tone of the market. So we obviously have a huge presence as well in the Middle East, which, as you can imagine, is very different to how it is in South Africa. Even in Australia, they don't have this dry sense of humor that we have. They just don't seem to understand the sarcasm that we can have in South Africa. So it really is unique to us, which means you really got to have people working on the brand, both on our side and on the agency side, that have a very close connection with South African humor. And we produce the South African content in South Africa. The UK guys, let them produce their comms in the UK, because we don't get it and they don't get ours.
You've collaborated successfully with your agencies over time, and the results are clear. We see them, and we've spoken about them a bit now. Can you describe one particular instance where the collaboration was really successful with an agency, and what made that one stand out for you?
So, there's so many examples that manifest in the littlest things, right? So, a lot of the kind of quick turnaround tacticals we do on social are really good. They're small, right? They're a tiny example in the grand scheme of things, but there's such a collaborative effort, and the amount of hands and minds that one social media post will touch in a matter of 4 hours is mind-blowing. It's almost more interaction and collaboration on that than on a above-the-line TVC. It's amazing. It's just this great example of that. So when that works really, really well, we've got our digital agency involved. We've got our above-the-line agency involved. We've got internal design guys involved. We've got the brand team from our side. We've got myself. We've got this amazing collection of people that can get things done really quickly and give very direct feedback and builds, and we can get it out quickly. I always love it. To use another example, I love when my ad agency proves us wrong. So we had a recent campaign, a TVC for Easter, which when we were going through the process of kind of building out the campaign and writing the scripts, I was feeling like, oh, this is just going to be another piece of retail comms, and it's going to work hard and it's going to do the jobs, and it's got a little bit of funny in there. And, the agency was pushing us, and we got a great director on board, and we went to casting, and the agency said to us, let us cast this guy. And we were like, he seems like and they were insistent, and we're like, fine, prove us wrong. And they proved us wrong. The way that this piece of comms was embraced by people was far beyond even what I could have comprehended. And there's nothing better than when an ad agency can prove us wrong. But again, just goes to that testament of the relationship of, they know this brand as well as we do. They live, eat, breathe the things that are important to us, and they can tell us when things are going to work out better than, at the time we may think ourselves. So there's hundreds of examples. The working process at Nando's it's just such an enjoyable one at the best of times. And even at the worst of times, it's still a ton of fun.
Yeah. And I know that you mentioned I think what you're talking about now, to me, comes down a lot to trust. Trusting your agency partner, and trusting that sometimes the differences in opinion or differences in how you should communicate that the agency brings in are good for the brand. And once again, for me, that is something that happens over years and happens over time. What are some of the things or ways that you've kind of put in place to go, if my agency pushes back on this one, I can let it slide because of this difference in I suppose in opinion that sometimes creativity expresses itself. And I ask this because as a brand that pushes the bar, you almost, as an outsider, you feel like not much can make Nando's uncomfortable. But actually, there are many things that make somebody from within the brand uncomfortable about what a creative person can propose. How do you overcome that discomfort sometimes?
So the funny thing about creativity, and you mentioned it about humor, and it's right for creativity as well, is that creativity is entirely subjective, right? And one of the it's such a contradiction, because one of the ways to get to really creative territories is diversity of thought, right? So all of a sudden you have this process which is made better by different opinions, but that in the approval, if you're going for different opinions and approval, you're going to land up kind of watering down an idea to the most commonly accepted version of it. So you've almost got to have diversity of thought and input and opinion in the beginning of the process, but at some point, you've got to all get behind a route, whether you think it's the best way in or whether you think it's going to do the best job. You've got to almost, in some instances, disagree and commit, right? What you don't want is people who are half in, half out, oh, I told you that wasn't going to work. You've got to all get behind it. Again, with our agencies, we've got the history and the relationship and the ability to have a frank conversation about the things that make us very uncomfortable. And similarly so, there are things that we ask of our agency that makes them uncomfortable. And our ECD can pick up the phone and say, guys, I know you're asking us to push this, but I really don't think we should for these reasons. So we're both pushing each other over the finish line. This certainly isn't a case of, the agency having to pull us to different and creative territories. It's kind of equal give and take on a lot of those things, but we can have honest conversations. We have, lists of non-negotiable things we simply will not do because of the risk to the brand, the risk, to our brand as a global brand. So as an example, we have very big, important markets in the UK, in the US, in Australia. So we're not going to throw shade at what's happening in the US or the UK or Australia because we have a global brand. Then we're not going to assume the right to comment on a different market. So we keep ourselves, here in South Africa. So that's like one of the non-negotiables. So if there's an idea that comes up with the agency that, potentially is random example at taking a stab at US politics, we'll have a conversation. We'll say, guys, for these reasons, we can't proceed with this piece of comms. You understand why? And they're like, oh, yes, of course. Makes total sense. We'll just move on. So it's just about having a sense of maturity. And again, it's all about that relationship. If you can have an honest conversation, even if it's at 10 o'clock at night, with an ECD who's really fighting for an idea, then absolutely, let's talk it out and we'll reach a point. But when we make a decision, everyone's got to be behind it. Whether you think it's the best or not, disagree, commit, and we're all pushing in the same direction.
On that, you mentioned the creative license that you have as a brand that has done this for decades and decades, and as a South African brand to South Africans, you've earned that many times over. I'm coming now to this being a global brand and some of your markets. Are you as brave, or at least let me ask it this way: is the market in all these other markets as welcoming of you being a South African brand, pushing the needle in their local politics and things like that? For instance, the same way that, you mentioned that we know the elections are coming up, and by the time this episode is released, the elections would have come and gone. But with the elections are happening in South Africa, elections are happening in the US as well. Are you, as a South African brand, do you have the same creative license in other markets to push the bar as you do here?
So we do in some respects. So the elections is a really great example, right? So Nando's point of view on the elections in South Africa and what's happening in the US won't be fundamentally different, partly because we have no point of view on politics. We really don't. And I know there is a political check and all that kind of stuff. We have no point of view on politics. What we fundamentally believe in as a brand is diversity, right? Inclusion and democracy. So we can have a point of view as Nando's USA on the USA electoral process because we believe in democracy. So, and they've done campaigns before in the previous US election as Nando's that were wildly successful because it brought to life democratic principles rather than political ones. Similarly, in South Africa, we're not about talking about politics. We're talking about being part of the process and, having an active stand in the democratic process. It's got very little to do with the political parties and the politicians as much as it does South Africans having a point of view, having a united voice and making a change for themselves. So it's less about the surface level thing. It's more about the values that drive behind it.
This episode is sponsored by the digitally led customer experience agency, Roger Wilco. For all your customer experience, digital marketing, and web development needs, go to rogerwilco.co.za or rogerwilco.co.uk. You can also download the South African CX Report and the Township CX Report directly from their website, free of charge. don't we all love something free every now and again? Especially with insights, right? Now back to the show.
So, I mean, we're not, in that example, we're not particularly new in that market. It's a little bit still of, the US market is huge, right? It's gigantic, and we're still a relatively small player. So we've kind of got that opportunity to be a little bit of a cult following, a little bit of a challenger brand, which in itself gives a little bit of permission, right? And again, you've got to start somewhere. So they're building that credibility over time. And even 4 years ago, in the previous elections, they had started seeding that narrative. And it's just the consistent application of that. Similarly, in the UK, we've been there for many, 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 many years. So we've got that right. In new markets, you've kind of got to establish where that amazing, kind of overlap is between what's important to the Nando's brand and our brand values and what's important to the market and the context, and find where those things overlap. If you just go to a new market and assume that they are interested in the things that we are interested in South Africa or in the UK or the US, you're likely to fall a little bit short. But if that's part of the process of launching a new brand in a country. You've got to be able to figure that out and use local talent from those markets to be able to guide you. We're never going to go as South Africans and impose our point of view as Nando's South Africa. We've got to team up with local agencies, local resources, local staff, local Nandokas, and make sure that they have an equal voice in determining what the brand means for that market.
AI is becoming more and more of the marketing process and the creative process in general. How do you use it as Nando's? How have you tapped into AI at all? Are you using it in any ways that are helpful for you as a brand?
So it's super interesting, right? And it's still very early on in the process. As long as AI is still making like 12-fingered humans, we've still got a while before it's going to take any of our jobs. But what's great about it, and I think what a lot of the hysteria doesn't think about, is the fact that if we can automate the automatable parts of our jobs, we can spend more time doing the thinking required to make the amazing work, right? Everything is, there is a lot of work in the system. If you're sitting on an agency side, there is ton loads of work in the system. You've got chase job bags scattered all over the place, lists of things, status reports, which are hundreds of things long. If you can get rid of a chunk of the stuff that can and should be automated, it's going to free up the time needed for, spending time in consumer places, being curious, going, watching cat videos, whatever inspires you, so that you have the headspace to do creative thinking. You can't schedule creative thinking. So if we can schedule all the stuff and clear the decks and clear the muck, it means we can have the creative thinkers spending time thinking creatively, which I think is an amazing prospect. How it affects agencies and the way they bill time is a whole other story, but it's really exciting. And we're absolutely exploring it to be able to say, there are things that are repeatable in the work that we do. There are, a rollout of performance assets. There are point of sale. There are all these things that are relatively template-based and repeatable. How do we optimize those things so that we can spend our time and spend our agency monies giving the agency time to think about the creative ideas that people are going to really remember?
I mean, you mentioned the 12-fingered humans. So, of course, AI is, criticized quite a lot for not being human enough on things that it ought to be, or at least areas that people believe it should be. Have you thought about ways of overlaying artificial intelligence with human intelligence to act on trends or at least follow them?
So, I mean, there's obviously a degree of AI baked into many things. So if you're using any kind of social media listening tool, there's a degree of AI baked into that's just helping kind of filter out and get to a point. We absolutely use AI. I will be the first person to admit I used ChatGPT to write my boss's birthday card because I was feeling relatively uninspired that day. We use it for these things, right? But But what's important, and you raised the most important thing, is that a human has got to be able to look at that and use a degree of critical thinking and say, is this a great, we use it a lot for copywriting as an example. If you need a thought start, a speech you need to give, or a press release or a holding statement, it's a great place to get, all the kind of facts put down. But there's a critical thinking aspect that at this stage can only be delivered by a human being that says, is this in the right tone of voice? Does this sound like it comes from Nando's? Is this how Nando's would treat this topic? Is this really relevant information and facts, that the chat GPT has just pulled off the internet? So you've got to have a degree of critical thinking. And again, when it comes to, appealing to human beings, as all marketing and all advertising and all comms should do is appeal to a human being, you've got to have a human being filter that, and you've got to put it through the ringer. Particularly at this stage, we let AI give us the thought starters, open the doors, create trains of thought, kind of collate social media sentiment so we have a direction to go in. But you're going to need human beings to be able to craft that and to make sure it's going to appeal to another human being at the end of the day.
On that note, Jessica, we've got a couple of sort of closing questions that we ask in every episode. And one of them is a question that we ask our previous guest for our next guest. And our last guest was Jack Skills, the CEO of Agency Agile. And the question he left for you was, what is the one thing that you have learned about managing and management over years that they don't teach in books, that people don't realize? In other words, what does it mean to have great management that is counterintuitive, that you learn through behavior rather than what you would have studied in books?
Oh gosh, for me, when it comes to, when you say management, I'm assuming I'm just going to connect the dots and say it's about managing people rather than managing processes, which are far more simple because they're relatively predictable. Managing people is hard, right? I am no expert at it, and I'd love to find an expert at it, because at the end of the day, people are different from each other, which is what makes it great, right? And if you want a great working environment, you want as many different people, but each one of them is going to have to be managed in a very specific way. If you are fundamentally interested in people and you are fundamentally interested in what motivates people, and you have a degree of empathy that allows you to understand that not everything in the world is the way that you see it, I honestly believe it's going to make you an infinitely better manager. So you've got to have a degree of empathy. But equally so, you can't manage everybody the same. There is no one size fits all. As long as you're interested in people, which is why marketers generally are great managers, because we are, through our craft, having to have this interest in people and what motivates them and what drives them, because we need them to buy stuff, right? So you've got to know what motivates them to do that. So you almost have a little bit of a head start in terms of understanding that people are motivated by different things, and having a degree of agility to be able to change one management style to another to suit different people is really, really important. It is exhausting, right? But particularly when you get, in my experience, the higher up you get and the more you climb this elusive corporate ladder, the more your job is about getting the best out of people and not about what you're performing or producing yourself. 90% of what I do is about making sure the people in my team and at my agencies are motivated, are pushing in the same direction, and every single one of them is different. So flexibility and empathy for me are the two most important things.
Now, same question to you. What's the one question that you'd like to ask our next guest about their approach to creative processes, to creative thinking, or thoughts on the industry?
So I'm always fascinated, and again, it comes down to a point of understanding that people are different. I am keen to ask your next guest, what is the number one thing killing creativity?
That's a fascinating question. Yeah, I'm sure they'll have fun answering that one. And lastly, Jessica, if you could ask any living person about their unique take on marketing, creativity, or life, who would that person be, and what is the one question that you would ask them?
Wow. Oh my goodness. Whew. Did you say living or dead, right? Or living?
Living.
Damn it.
Living, yeah.
Always want to ask the dead people things. Who would I ask? So I would probably ask... Oh, I know exactly who I'd ask. This is going to sound bizarre. So I would ask Kanye West about creativity, to explain his creative process, and to almost give a little bit of a behind the scenes in how resilient he is to popular culture's opinion, because he just doesn't care, right? And he's got a very distinct point of view. He has a very consistent application of what seems like it's completely bizarre to us. But there's something driving that. He is an innately creative person. He's very smart. If you listen to him in interviews and in podcasts, he's incredibly smart. So it makes me think he has a strategy and he has a point of view. And maybe it's a little bit too futuristic for what we can accept today. But he also just doesn't give a right. And I think that's part of to a certain degree, being a great creative is being protected from outside opinion and being really committed to your craft. But I'd love to sit and have a chat with him and understand his thought process.
He would be a fascinating one to ask that question. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Jessica, thank you so much for making the time. This was a fascinating conversation. We'd love to have you on again another time. But yeah, thank you for making the time. It was great.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to The Lead Creative. Did you get one insight that's worth sharing from this episode? Please share it with your network or your friends. Pop me some of your ideas and innovative finds on Twitter on @Mongezi. This podcast is available on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple, Google, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also find me on mongezi.com.